Hello, and welcome to a discussion of the second annual survey of transportation management practices of top performers. My name is Mark Solomon. I'm executive editor of news for DC Velocity magazine. Descartes and DC Velocity jointly conducted this survey. We did the same last year. This is the second of what we hope will be many annual surveys to come. We believe the findings of the study will help transportation and supply chain professionals better understand today's dynamic transportation landscape and the strategies, tactics, and technologies that are being used by top performing companies. Before we continue, there are a couple of housekeeping items to address. We will be taking questions from the audience at the end of today's presentation. Please use the Q&A function on the left side of your screen to submit your questions. If we are unable to get to your question in the time allotted, we will have someone follow up with you directly. Questions that may arise subsequent to the conclusion of the seminar can be submitted to info@descartes.com. That is info@descartes.com. Lastly, today's presentation is being recorded and will be made available to all registrants. You will receive the link for the replay along with a copy of the slide presentation via email within the next 24 hours. At this time, I would like to introduce Chris Jones, Executive Vice President at Descartes. Chris, who oversaw the development of the survey, is primarily responsible for Descartes' marketing and professional services organizations. In his more than 30 years in the supply chain field, Chris has held various senior management positions. This includes Senior Vice President at the Aberdeen Group's Value Chain Research Practice, Executive Vice President of Marketing and Corporate Development for Synquest, Vice President and Research Director for Enterprise Resource Planning Solutions at the Gartner Group, and Associate Director of Operations and Technology at Kraft General Foods. With that, Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. Welcome everyone to today's session. We're going to, as Mark was talking, run through it. There's a fair number of slides. I'm going to try to keep it moving, with the idea that we have plenty of time at the end for questions. So as Mark said, we did this last year, and we came up with, I'll call, a formula for this research. We've made just minor modifications to it based on, I'll call it, some things that have been changing in the market. But the rest of the survey is very much in line with what we did last year. And we think that's going to be important. And you'll see as we go through the session, the differences in some cases and the absolute sameness in other cases versus 2017. So 4 main parts to what we're going to cover today: a little bit on the demographics, what are the key trends and practices driving transportation management in the market, strategies and tactics that are being employed, and particularly looking at the difference between top performing companies and organizations, and I'll call it the rest of the pack. And then lastly, all those things being said, what are the technology implications and where do we see people's focus in transportation management technology? So with that in mind, we'll get to the demographics. Versus last year, probably the thing I'd say that was, I'll call it a good mix was the companies that participated. You can see again, I'll call it a lot of distribution-oriented companies, as well as a lot of organizations who transportation or logistics services are their business. So really it's that those 3 players along with discrete manufacturing. We also saw a wide dispersion of industries here. And I think it's really important for a survey like this to have a lot of different organizations here, so we're not, for instance, driven by solely retail or solely third-party logistics service providers and so forth. From a coverage perspective, it's actually broader than before. It's one of the things we try to focus on a little bit differently this year in how we're getting the word out. Obviously, most of the audience is North American-based or time zone, but we think that, and based on our experience as a global organization, that a lot of the challenges, believe it or not, are similar across the globe. So it's really good to hear, for instance, from Europe or Latin America as an example. And the other thing that we were able to do was to get a significant number of organizations to participate with what I'll call larger spend. So it's not really, it's a little bit of a rat's tail in terms of some smaller customers, which is also good, and participants, and as well as larger organizations. And maybe one last thing I should mention is that the survey itself, as we did this, wasn't just, for instance, just Descartes customers or just DC Velocity followers. It's really a very broad set that we wanted to get out to, so it goes beyond really the coverage that the two organizations have. As far as transportation modes, I think there should be no surprise. It's heavily driven by surface transportation, over-the-road transportation. And what was also interesting was to see the percentages in upwards of 50% people that were doing international shipping, primarily ocean, and obviously, and to a great degree, air, which is not always international, but quite heavily driven that way as well. So you can see it tails off a little bit as you move into things like private and dedicated, which, for this kind of survey, I would say would be something we would expect to see. Now, as we get into a little bit deeper into the demographics, we had two hypotheses that we went after last year, and if you will, all the questions that we asked for anybody that participated, you would have seen this, but for the folks who didn't, what we did was we went through and said, we asked, I'll call it very basic questions, just like the ones you just saw in terms of where, what kind of business you're in, where are you located. And then as we get into the next sets of questions, as you'll see, they're also very generic. But what we did was we asked two very specific questions here. One was how strategic was transportation viewed by management, all right? So how important is transportation to management? And then we also asked them on a relative basis how well they were doing financially. And we used those two breakdowns, and I'll go through them in a second here. We use those two to be able to evaluate and cross-reference all the questions that come after this. Now, in some cases, there's no difference in some of the areas, but I think in some you're going to see what's going on here. And so, a big question we had was, if management thinks it's important, is it really driving the organization? So in other words, as we write here, self-fulfilling prophecy, and also we want to know, I'll call it the relationship between the view of the importance of transportation with how well they're doing financially. So you'll hear us talk about through this, the rest of this, about companies that believe transportation management provides competitive advantage versus those that think it's pretty much a necessary evil, a requirement of the business, right? And then equally on the financial side, we said, okay, how is their financial performance? Do they believe they're industry leading, or are they just kind of in middle and below? You can see not really too many on the below factor, but I think you'll see as we go through here, it's these kind of combination of things make for some very interesting results. So the first thing we did was we took those two questions and we compared them against each other. So we said, okay, how well did you do financially based on how important management believed that transportation is? All right. And if you look at the blue bars in particular on the left chart, those people that viewed transportation as a competitive weapon were much more likely to have industry-leading performance. It's roughly 4 to 5 times as much. So it's pretty significant difference. Those people that don't believe it's that big a deal, they tended to shift to the left. Although, you could say, and I'll just say this based, and you're going to see it in a second, based on the economy, most people aren't suffering, but it really is still a good indication that people that, view transportation, and we'll go through the why later, as important, tend to do better financially. We flipped the question around. Okay, we said basically here, how well financially or how strategic are you doing by financial performance, all right? So in this case, leading financial performers, again, tend to view a little bit more on the competitive weapon side, but way more on the customer service differentiator, which to me, depending on how you really look at that, they're somewhat similar, maybe just a little bit of degree. Again, here, this is probably the better indication of where people that don't believe it's a competitive differentiator there, those yellow bars on that right chart tend to slide to the right here. So, you know, a good indication here, I think, of a relationship between the management's perception of transportation management and how well they do financially. Now, interestingly, we took another chart that we did last year, and we said, well, how about growth? Let's talk about growth, and could we compare those organizations, again, both, you know, from a strategic importance and financial performance, and say, is there a difference? And if you look at it, there's not really very much difference at all. They line up actually pretty amazingly, which is much different than last year. You know, I think the thing that really kind of struck me as we went through this is globally, pretty much every economy is in really pretty good shape. Europe has turned around significantly over the last 2 to 3 years. And North America has just been on a really an 8-year run. This one didn't show what it showed last year, which was those people that were, again, more top performer focused, were much more likely to be growing faster. Here, it didn't play out, and I thought it would be good just to show that this has happened, you know, and we'll obviously keep an eye on that for next year's study. So let's talk about key trends and practices. What's really driving the industry? The first thing we did was we asked the question that, and you'll see the top 4 answers here. But we asked a question that had a larger number of areas that we included in it: cross-border logistics, security, things like you know, driverless vehicles, crowdsourced logistics, in terms of different choices that people had here. And you can see, and I don't think this is any surprise to anybody, that the capacity-related choices were top of mark here. However, what was interesting is hours of service specifically really dropped down, and I don't think that should be a surprise to anybody, given that the mandates literally, you had to be ready. Last year you didn't have to be ready. Now you have to be ready. And so, you know, the issue still exists in terms of capacity, but not necessarily maybe what was driving it, like hours of service compliance. What's also interesting is e-commerce got to be bigger, and for us it's straight up and classic sense of e-commerce, but also I'll call it home delivery. Home delivery does not have to be e-commerce in the classic e-commerce sense. If you think about it, you can still go to stores and buy things and get them delivered. There's just a huge global shift to particularly getting larger format goods, but also quite a few other things delivered to the home. This is taking capacity out of the market, or I should say absorbing it is probably the better term. And when you look at the growth of e-commerce, and I'll just give everybody a frame of reference, it's slated to grow, grew 20+% last year, 2017, about 25%. It's slated to grow 15 to 20% the next 3 to 4 years. That, you know, e-commerce has a truck on it, and when it comes to delivery, right, every time, because we are not going to pick things up at stores and other places, right? So now what you see is we not only have issues with enough drivers and just capacity in general, but we have the demand, consumer demand, shifting to more and more e-commerce and home delivery. So this is just going to continue to make this a big challenge for the next couple of years. Another key thing we looked at was what is causing organizations to do things differently in transportation management. So what's the basic business requirements? What I think is interesting about this one is, in particular, improved customer service is top of list here, not too far following with business growth, and immediately following with cost reduction. Talk to most transportation or supply chain management professionals, and they're going to say we're always getting chase for cost. But what's interesting, I think, is ultimately that's going to be the name of the game, a requirement. I hate to say this, you're not going to get a lot of credit for doing a good job at it. But the things that really are, I'll call it as much elemental in that game, are really looking at transportation as an enabler, all right? And that's really what improved customer service and business growth are about. What's also interesting here is that they've increased versus last year, all right? So customer service is up 18%, business growth was up 29%, all right? And the fourth choice, which you don't see on here, is new channels. So this whole notion, if you're familiar with the concepts of omnichannel and so forth, is getting and being able to serve customers through multiple channels is up significantly. So, and then when we look at the individuals here, I'll call it the blue bars and the yellow bars are the top performers. Again, more heightened focus on service, all right, growth in particular, and even cost reduction. So I think it kind of fits in the game here that you know, there's going to be that tension that you're going to continue to see in terms of being better at service and, oh, by the way, got to cut costs. Now, another key thing that we looked at last year and this year was the key kinds of metrics that people are using. We made a little tweak to just maybe, I'll call it, be better at describing the metrics. So cost per shipment type of metric, whether it's cost per delivery, cost per, you know, ton or pound, or all kinds of things like that fall into that cost per shipment bucket. Service level target's the same, and then the other two you can see are what I call moving out of the supply chain space. These are really important metrics. We'll talk about them through this rest of this presentation, because these get to I'll call it the customer facing and revenue side of the world here. Now, no surprise that people have cost per shipment. To a less degree here, the service targets, even though service, as we just said, was much more important. But look at the difference between the people who believe transportation management is a competitive advantage for contribution to revenue growth and contribution to competitive differentiation, all right? We'll go through this later. I will just say it now, and I'll say it later again, is that, you know, if you're not capturing this, you're really missing the value that transportation management can provide an organization here. So people that get it know that if they're really good at and excel at transportation management in a whole number of different ways, they can actually really impact their ability to grow the business and compete. So this is probably as you know, to me, as much of a story as anything here in the rest of this presentation. Another key point that we looked at, and this is a little bit of an eye chart, so I'll try to run through it and get everybody up to speed on it. What we tried to do here was, on the left side is what I'll call the four walls of the transportation organization. Where are you sharing your information? So, and as we move to the right, it gets you out of not just the supply chain into the, I'll call it, revenue owners and customer owners, to the customers and your trading partners and carriers. What you'll see overall is no surprise. Again, the yellow and blue bars are more of the top performers. Pretty much across the board, they tend to do more in a number of the areas than the laggards do. What's also interesting is if you actually just really eyeball this, you'll see it pretty much declines, and particularly as you move out to the sales organizations and customers themselves. And this is really, again, really important in terms of thinking about the value of transportation management information. Who can be using that and what can they do with it? So I think there's a tremendous amount of work to be done here. Suppliers are probably in the, you know, they're the lowest really if you can see this on the chart. Carriers, no surprise that they're part of that mix. I mean, really good carrier collaboration is important these days. But if you notice, we're not talking 100% here. So there's still plenty of work to do, and particularly by the laggards. So the moral to this whole story in this particular slide is that you really need to look at where you're sharing that information. There's value to so many different organizations like customer service and sales and so forth that would help them do a better job and help serve customers better. And again, would promote the value that you're really getting from your transportation management systems. So we'll move on quickly to strategies and tactics. is what are people doing based on some of the things we just discussed. So the first one was what's the competition doing? And we thought this was a really interesting question to ask, and we started it last year, and we'll talk about some changes versus this year. But ultimately, if you are using transportation to compete, or you're not, but you're seeing your competition doing something to get a step on you, what is really those things? And in this case, this year, faster deliveries, followed very closely by lower costs. So think about those two things. Put a lot of pressure on organizations. Faster doesn't necessarily mean cheaper. It usually means the opposite. And so if you're already under pressure for cutting costs, this just makes it that much tougher. But you can see that low free costs moved from number 5 last year to number 2 this year. All right. And the good news, don't know, slipped slightly here. And we what's important, and if you were on this call last year, we talked about this, which is don't know is not a good thing because transportation can be used to compete, and if you don't really know how your competition is using it to add value to get your customers or grow their market share in other ways, this is really important here. Now, what's also interesting is things like disruptive technologies, which tend to get a lot of coverage in the market, weren't really considered to be the things, at least at this point, that are making a difference from a competitive perspective. So having said that, what kind of strategies are people employing? And the way to think about this is that, believe it or not, you take the same software and do something brilliant with it. You can take the same software and do something absolutely mediocre. Same thing with business processes and so forth. So the idea here was to capture how are people thinking about the kinds of practices that they want to employ. That could be things like moving to same day as an example, or value-added services that they're doing, or a whole number of other different areas that are considered to be more leading edge today. Now, if you look at this, leading edge practices were dominant, which I think is a little bit of a hubris by the respondents. But I also thought was really different when we compared the top performers, those people that think transportation management is a competitive weapon. They are way more likely to be trying to create or adopt leading edge practices here. So they're really at the forefront of taking transportation and using it in ways that really add value to their customers and their bottom line here. All right, so again, that's the blue bars. You look at the gold bars here, they are, again, shifting more to the right. And again, this really ties back into the whole notion of if you don't believe it's something that's significant, you're really not going to get out on the edge, and probably also you're not really going to do as well. So this, again, a good way for people to think about what they're doing in transportation. Now, we also said, given those things that are going on, what are you going to do? What are the areas you're going to focus on? So you can see it's everything from do nothing and stay the course to use technology as a way to drive things, obviously cut costs, change their strategies, look for new service providers, and even outsource. So quite the gamut of potential ways to address changes that are coming in the market. Overall, technology was the winner, but it was down about 12 points from last year. When we think about looking for new service providers, it jumped to number 2. I think with the capacity crunch that's going on, everybody is out there to some degree or another looking for new sources. And then change strategy, which was number 2 last year, is though number 3. But I highlighted the area in the red box, which really shows, I think, the difference in thinking between people that are more strategically focused and those that are not. Cut costs, again, highest focus there. Change strategy, I think, is really a good one versus looking for new service providers. It's really, I'll call it a focus here. Change strategy could be things like, how do I do a better job with the carriers I work with? Are there ways that I can take advantage of things like intermodal as an example. It's really looking at being different. Okay, look for transportation providers, again, important these days, but again, probably much more tactically focused. Same thing with cutting costs. You got to go do it, but it's probably not going to move the needle in the business. So I thought that was some pretty important findings. So what are people doing in terms of the strategy and tactics to improve transportation value? So again, what are you doing to help with transportation to the enterprise? Cutting costs, top of mind. Like I said, this is one that's out there. It's interesting. Again, it's this current that's constantly there. Automate processes was number 2 versus last year. They swapped spots. Similar types of numbers. We had some other areas which I did not include on here, but before I get into those in a second on this chart, as you notice again, the people who are much more strategic are top performer type of folks. Cost is less of a focus versus the people that don't focus on as much, and things like automation, which can lead to better, more reliable service, more flexibility. Were much more the focus. So again, a flip-flop in the thinking there. And the areas that we also included, like centralization of transportation management, value-add services, they changed positions slightly, more focus on centralization. But again, here, that current of cost out there, but also much heavier focus by those people who are really viewed as a necessary evil. So last thing in this particular area that I wanted to focus on was capabilities needed to run transportation effectively. So these are the things you have to have. We did it at a kind of a very high level here, but I think it really tells a pretty interesting story. Visibility, again, was the top requirement that people needed, the capability. It was up 7 points even from last year. And then what we call the core TMS types of things, the classic things you would see in a TMS, the rating, order management, execution, carrier bid were the next 4. Biggest change from versus 2017, you could see order management moving up to number 3, and business intelligence moving from number 8 to actually it should be number 6 here. Little typo in this chart here. What's the story here? We'll talk about this through the rest of the presentation because the visibility continues to show up. If you think about traditional transportation management and working with common carriers, execution once the truck has left your dock has really been a black hole, as people are looking for to be faster, more reliable, and so forth, they really want to understand what's actually happening to those shipments. Technologically, it was a big challenge for quite a long time, and over the last couple of years, been able to address that. Now you have much better visibility, even if you're using forwarders and brokers. In this particular case, doing much more in that area to provide that kind of visibility. So again, we'll see this going forward in the rest of this presentation. Part of the challenge with visibility is how are people doing it. So we looked at a couple different ways of describing that, and what you'll see here is on the left side is we don't do anything, to we use some of the more advanced state-of-the-art real-time GPS tracking technologies to get those updates. Overall, EDI was the number 1 answer across the board for all respondents, but real-time GPS has come along quite a way. Again, you can see here the leaders are much more to that right side of the equation. As you know, we look at organizations continuing to want to have a better view of what's going on and use that data to help make decisions on their business. This is going to be this is going to continue to grow. I think you'll see, I'll call it a shift to the right here. I think the challenge for laggards are that many of the things that they're doing, the classic things you think about, spreadsheets, email, et cetera, calls, are still fairly heavily embedded there. This is going to be, I think, make a big difference as companies look to be able to do things like offer tracking services for their customers, as an example, or even to better understand flow of goods into their organizations. Turn to technology implications here. Well, the first thing we did was we asked about where, we asked about business strategy earlier. Now we're talking about technology strategy adoption. So this is a classic view of, I'll call it 4 kinds of companies out there, those that, again, adopt technologies as they come out, sometimes even inventing them. That's the early adopters. Fast followers are ones that hear great things and say, I need to do this. Middle of the pack is, okay, I heard a bunch of people are doing this. And laggards are, okay, everybody else is doing this, and it's 10 years later, I should be doing it too. So this curve looked like what I have seen from my previous experience, not just here, but in other organizations, is more of what I would describe as reality. Typically speaking, early adopters are only in that 20% range. Laggards, the same thing. And most people are middle of the pack, and that's really what we see here. So not so big a deal here. But what was interesting here, if you notice in the notes, that better financial performers were twice as more likely to be early adopters than poorer ones. So again here, and this will be something else you'll see, is that people who believe believe it matters, transportation management matters, and the technology matters, and are doing financially better, are ones that tend to be on that left side of that chart. So another area we focused on was IT spend. Just as in 2017, we saw the bars to be to the left here. There'll be an increase. But I think is really interesting is if you focus on the blue versus the gold. The blue bars are much more to the left than the gold bars. So again, it's those people who essentially what they're doing. Whoops, got ahead here. The folks in the that believe it's a competitive weapon are putting their money where their mouth is, and that plus 5% is really the differentiator here. So you can see it's a big difference. And if we put that in with more advanced strategies, these two really go hand in hand. And I think this is just something for companies to watch in terms of what they're doing and how they're doing it. Technology is just so much at the, business process and culture are key here, but technology is such a huge enabler in transportation management. So I think there's more importance overall, which is good news, but it's really for those people that believe it the most. Another key thing we focused on was looking at, all right, you say you're going to go spend more money. Are you really going to be able to spend it? In other words, what are there obstacles out there or not? There's 5 real areas we considered here. Payback not clear, so you don't really know where the ROI is if you use the classic term. Not a priority to the management team. Then maybe good things to do, but relative to everything else that needs to be done. This is a key area. Organization not ready to address change that a new transportation management system might bring. Basically taking it outside, and then no obstacle. So I don't think, based on every other slide we went through, that this slide should be a surprise to everybody else. The no obstacle was clearly being driven by those people. Again, better run companies, a more strategic view of transportation management. And the ones who are struggling, in particular, when you look at things like executive priority, are the ones that really don't believe it matters to them, or they're not doing it as well. So we tie this with the previous slide we just looked at. It really starts to paint a picture of who's going to not only say they're going to spend more money, but really actually spend it. So where's the focus going to be? Here you're looking at the greatest value, visibility. Again, no surprise based on everything we talked about. But on a relative basis, that was 37% for everybody. Execution, which ties very tightly into visibility at 31, immediately followed by rating and optimized planning, which I think are things that people would normally think about. Performance analysis showed up very closely behind it. This is, I think, a trend you're going to see in more and more. There's so much valuable information that's available, not just on things like carrier performance, your own ability to execute, a number of things that really are core, I'll call core data elements that exist in transportation management, and understanding that performance is going to be more and more important. So you need tools to be able to do that because it's a ton of data, right? And then areas that just didn't get a lot of attention, carrier bid, contract management, you can see them pretty small, all the same specialty modes, vehicle control in and out, so things like dock appointment yard management, audit and international shipping are areas that, they were kind of on that long tail of importance for organizations. Now, once we've said what's important, again, where are you going to focus with your investment here? Visibility at top of the list here, even a little bit more so than the previous slide, and difference between visibility and things like performance management, rating, and optimized planning and execution. Now, I'm going to go back for 1 second. So if you will, on this slide, visibility, on the previous slide we're on now, visibility, execution, planning, and then performance analysis, all right? Here is visibility again is top. Performance analysis overall showed up as number 2, followed by these other 2. So they're all kind of in the same boat here, but I think that's really pretty significant. Again, you can see it was number 4 last year, number 2 this year. And again, in general, some more heightened investment focus by the more of the top, particularly those with, again, strategic value was on things like planning and visibility. This just again points to, I think, that whole notion of they're going to spend more money. They're going to basically look at that in those places where they think it's going to make a difference to the business. And those areas are really around more improvement in terms of customer service, et cetera. And oh, by the way, and I got to take care of costs too. So just to wrap up here before we get to questions, there's definitely a relationship between management strategic value and financial performance here. If you higher strategic value, you're going to have, it just shows in here that we're going to see better financial performance. Carrier capacity is such a huge issue, and we don't, as I mentioned, we expect that to continue on. So it'll be interesting to see in the next couple of years how this plays out. If there are other core issues to the market, but this one really is out there. And again, we think e-commerce is going to continue to make it challenging to catch up on it. Technology is still the top choice for addressing trends, but it's really followed by looking at new carriers overall and changing strategies. Those two probably really go hand in hand more than people think as they try to find ways to address that issue, particularly around capacity. Visibility, as we've mentioned multiple times, it's not only the top capability, but technology requirement. It's good. I'll just say it's good to see what people say is important is where they think they're going to go put their money. So I think that just ties in pretty nicely. If you look at the narrative through the whole presentation, what you're going to find is, like the good news is we're seeing a little bit less of a challenge for people getting projects approved here, but it's still down in the 30% range. That means 60+%, really simple math, 2/3 of the people who want to make investments are challenged to get those investments approved. And that's because we're not doing as good a job as we can showing the overall value. If we're stuck in just the cost bucket and we don't get a chance to talk about how we're helping to grow revenue, how we're serving customers better, all those other areas, we're really missing an opportunity to have transportation management stand up really at the top of the list of things that companies should be focused on. And then the last point is spend again. The last 2 years it said it's going to go up, but again, visibility being the top piece as we mentioned, but also it's going to be twisted towards those people who are placing an emphasis on transportation management from a business perspective here. And I think that's really important to understand. It's all about people understanding that they can do more with their business because they're better at transportation management. So with that in mind, I will stop at this point and turn it back over to Mark for questions.
Thank you, Chris. As I said at the beginning, there's a Q&A function screen. You should be able to send questions in. We will answer or respond to as many on the webcast as time allows. First question for Chris. Visibility takes different forms. Did you drill down into what respondents mean by visibility, how often they want to see shipment status? Do they want visibility to extend across the entire supply chain and not just specific to tracking shipments? And the second part about the visibility question is that going to be the catalyst to get more C-level executives to understand the value that a TMS can bring to their organization?
Okay, thank you, Mark. Yeah, it's a great question. So let's maybe answer it in two parts here. So visibility, and I'll call it pure transportation movement visibility by itself, not having it and then now being able to have is important. What's more important is what you do with that information, and this is where it definitely goes beyond the transportation organization. So let me give you two ways to think about this. So if you're talking about inbound visibility, if you have the ability to accurately understand and predict when goods are going to come in, you can do a much better job at pre-deploying the inventory in the truck, right? So it isn't about the shipment. It's about the inventory that's in the shipment, okay? So tying those two things together allows companies to decide, which things they're going to flow directly through in a cross-dock style, which things that they're going to maybe stage, as an example, based on other things that are happening. There's a lot more decisions that can be made when you have a high degree of confidence in the data and you merge the data together. So that data really does need to be the physical movement along with what's in that shipment, right? So bringing those two pieces together. On the other side of that, on the outbound side, it's somewhat similar, if you will, for customers, being able to let them understand what's coming, and for them to use that as part of their business decision process here. So again, pulling those two pieces together. So visibility ultimately means a lot more different pieces. Mark?
Hello?
Yeah, I'm here.
Chris, okay. I had a 15 seconds of dead air there. Let me ask relay a question from one of the attendees, S. Lindsay. Refers to interoperability. What trends do you see in a single solutions provider providing end-to-end operability with its current and target customer base so all can see the key information in real time and there is greater time to not only see the data but optimize it and hopefully migrate to 100% performance? I guess, is there one provider who can achieve that for a customer?
I guess maybe I look too broadly. I'd say the answer is probably not. And I think this is going to be this challenge isn't going to go away. So let's do the following. When it comes to visibility, and this is beyond transportation, the single view database in the sky is, I think, still a pipe dream. And the issue for that is there's really a couple pieces to it. One of them is defining a data model that's truly universal. This to me is like, if anybody happens to know anything about Albert Einstein, he spent, after coming up with the theory of relativity, he spent probably the next 40 years of his life trying to come up with the unified theory, and it never happened. All right, it's too complex to model, and then to bring all the pieces together. I think what you'll see is more and more convergence, but I also think you're going to see it in areas where there can be agreement, and there's and your ability to get all of the different constituents together. For instance, in automotive, as an example, there's a huge amount of standardization that's in the automotive market, particularly inbound into manufacturing. But that's really also driven by the big OEMs and having that ability. That's another factor here. I think what the best thing for people to think about and work their way into is how can I take, I'll call it chunks of my business where end-to-end is understood, okay, and the different trading partners have, I'll call it some defined roles here that can be easily understood. When we think about it, let's do it this way. Some of this stuff has been going on for a while. What's changing now that's probably making it even more powerful is that, for instance, now you can get real-time carrier visibility where that didn't exist before. You would have EDI messages, as an example, but you wouldn't know exactly where that truck was, what the real ETA was, and so forth. Even if you have secured goods, as an example, you want to understand, for instance, are they somewhere where they're not supposed to be? So there could be diversion and everything else like that. So now all of a sudden you have a lot more data. So I think what you're going to see is constant evolution in this space. But I think the best way to think about end-to-end is pragmatically is what can you, when you look in either direction, and that end-to-end story is, what can you see that you can actually act on? So I think for companies, there are some logical decoupling points depending on the business as to where they want that end-to-end to be.
Okay. I think to some degree we saw this last year, saw it again this year, a gap between companies where the management sees the strategic value of TMS and those companies where management views it as a necessary evil. What is behind the difference? We use the word culture a lot. Is that really at the heart of this gap, or is it something else?
Well, I think culture is part of it. I also believe, I'll call it's what you see in companies that are doing a phenomenal job in the market in terms of growth and competitiveness is they recognize that they have a lot of different weapons they can use. And I'll just say it's coming out of the CPG market years ago. Literally, probably one of the most telling comments I ever heard was that the competition was based on product quality and marketing. Well, that by definition just meant that they left out and supply chain, by the way, was the get it done folks. That just meant that they left out a big part of the business. What's great about what's happening now is there's just so many examples, and I'll just give one. We have a customer that sells sand. They sell sand at a premium, and the reason they sell sand at a premium, which is the most undifferentiated product on the planet, is because they do time-definite same-day delivery. So that CEO understands that is a lever that he can use. All right, and what's important for people to get in terms of that management perspective is, we used to think, and particularly, I'll just say it, in the age of e-commerce and the internet, there's so much visibility at the product level that your ability to get sourced from multiple locations, things like price aren't necessarily a competitive advantage. You have to be in a range, right, to be able to get business. From there, it becomes, okay, how are you really servicing that customer? And so that's where we see those people that get that if I do that, in a compelling way, I will get more customers. So it's not even just about being fast. It's about being flexible. It's about being reliable. It's about what are value-added services. And then the last piece that we talked about before in this whole visibility discussion, it's what can customers use with the data that you provide them around their deliveries that adds value to their business.
Okay. This question comes in from Michael. Says, besides cost per shipment or cost per pound, does anyone measure outbound freight as a percentage of net sales? And if so, are there any benchmarks out there?
That's a great question. We did not focus on that for this particular study. There are people out there like Chainalytics that do transportation benchmarking. I'm not sure what they're doing in terms of, and they do some pretty extensive benchmarking. But I'm not sure if they're capturing the revenue side of the equation. And I think the one thing I would say here is, we need to be careful about things like measuring percent of net sales, because here's the point that you got to be careful about, which is if you view it as cost only and you don't view it as revenue, a revenue component, then you're really going to miss a big piece of the story here. So you could, and I'll just give you just a quick example. Have a customer who was, again, focused on that cost per outbound, realizing that they weren't doing a good job of, I'll call it real-time calculation of freight costs. They had standard freight costs. So in some cases, they were just losing their shirt where they weren't necessarily applying those charges to the customers based on unique customer requirements. So in this particular case, once they figured out that that was a big issue, they were actually able to grow their revenue. So you also want to look at not just cost per revenue or net sales. You want to look at how much revenue that's included in that net sales number that's really related to transportation. That's really one of the missing things that people are not talking about. And that was one of the things I mentioned earlier in terms of one of the slides, that not being captured really well, because you can grow your revenue. And there's two ways to think about it. There's actual selling of transportation services. People will do that. We could do a whole seminar just on that. But the other thing is also making sure you tie it to, did we get more sales because we offer certain kinds of transportation services? I'll give you an example, one last thing, and I'll be quiet, which is on this one, which is if you focus on, for instance, the construction market, your ability to serve more contractors at the beginning of the day will drive your business, your revenue, okay? Because they need it for their crews, and so your ability to maximize that capacity when they want it will definitely cause your company to sell more lumber or roofing shingles, etc. So making sure you get tied into that is really important.
Do you, and this question comes from Steve, do you observe a clear technology that could be used to provide the most leverage for achieving visibility, and what would those be?
Well, okay, again, it's back into the definition of visibility. If I'm going to deliberately be a little narrow here, so I apologize if I don't get to every aspect of it. Right now, you have a couple things going on in the commercial transportation space that make it much more possible than ever to really do a great job of tracking shipments. One of them is the ability to do real-time GPS triangulation of phones. All right, so where you don't have to involve carriers in it, you don't have to have dedicated apps, etc. That has helped to really revolutionize that particular market. And again, we need to think about the classic owner-operator or smaller carriers that are out there that people use. they're not going to be technology enabled. So how do you essentially have them do what they need to do with next to no technology? So that's really what was important in that respect, right? And then obviously the other thing now is with ELD, there is an absolute benefit to ELD, which is the ability to now track based on the ELD technology that's available. So what the mandates that come on is that, you now have the potential to aggregate that data in a much easier way. Again, not necessarily having to do anything with the driver per se. So those two areas really have kind of have converged to provide a lot more tracking than you could before. And again, I'm just keeping it to discussion the transportation here specifically. So.
In the study, I was surprised to see that improved customer service and business growth were more important drivers than cost. Yet every time management seems to be asked to do more, we are asked how much money we are going to save. So is there a continued disconnect between the traditional way of looking at investments and the more, I guess, progressive way of looking at them?
Well, one is cost is going to be in the equation, especially now because it's rising, much more rapidly than probably most parts of people's businesses. So it's really going to be top of mind, and you're going to have a key part of the conversation needs to be there. But after that, it really becomes looking at, is it, you're going to, again, let's go back to what I mentioned before, in the contractor world. Are you, to get a greater, to grow your contractor business, as an example, are you, and this is something that Home Depot talked about at our user conference in early March, was, their focus was on getting to those contractors earlier in the day and faster, all right? And they were tracking, in this case, the growth in revenue that they were getting as part of the process here. So, since most industries at the moment, and I'll just talk about North America in general, but most industries in general in North America are in growth mode. Your ability to serve your customers is a big deal. Given the capacity constraints are out there, as an example, we're going to always be pushed for trying to do it the lowest cost way. But I'm going to tell you that from people that I've talked to in the market, making sure you have the capacity and you can access it in a very reliable way, fast and reliable, I should say, is equally important, because revenue doesn't happen for many companies until virtually every company, I should say, until the goods show up, right? So this is where we need to look at again, that constant current of cost, but really think of, now you got to put yourself in the head of sales or the CEO or president's seat. Growth is the profitable growth, mind you, is the probably top thing that people are looking for. So you need to be able to be part of that conversation, and I think that's why we're seeing people say service is a big part of that, and looking at ways to expand the business, and having that being part of that conversation is what will make the difference.
Okay. With that, we will wrap up today's webinar. I want to thank Chris Jones both for the presentation and his commentary. Just to remind the audience again that if you have questions that obviously were not addressed during the webinar, to submit them to info@descartes.com. And again, the presentation has been recorded and will be made available to all of you. With that, my name is Mark Solomon, executive editor of DC Velocity Magazine. Thank you all for taking the time out of your schedule to participate and engage with us, and we will talk soon. Thank you very much.